I'm now pleased to introduce Jay Kola from Termlex, who will be presenting experiences of standardising pathology lab tests in secondary care using SNOMED CT. Please go ahead, Jay.
Hey guys, hopefully you can hear me. Can I make sure you can all hear me and see my screen okay? I guess I'll say yes, because obviously clearly I can't see what you guys are saying, but okay. So lovely to be here, and actually really interesting that we are the first session in this stream. So today I'm here to share some experiences of apologies. That's just our standard fire alarm going off at 10:30, right? So I'll keep talking over it, but if you can still hear the fire alarm after 5 minutes, then you know I need to run. Okay, it stopped. So I'm here to actually share some experiences of using the SNOMED CT for standardizing lab tests and data. So obviously this is a space clearly that a lot of people generally either look at a different standard. Okay, I won't mention it, or we could say, how do you do this in SNOMED? So we are here to share some of those experiences. And before I do anything, I said we because we are a team. So I'm from Termlex. We're a team who essentially a bunch of, how can I say, terminology experts / geeks. And we also happen to then have experience of working in different NRCs. We create products, but our area of interest is in standards, certainly around lab standards. So we also have a bunch of products. I'm not here to sell you the company. I'm only here to say that sometimes when I refer in this presentation to a product, then that's that thing that we were actually referring to. So that was a very quick overview of who we are. So, and I can see people still walking in, but I'll continue. So some background as to why this work matters and what this is. So this is work that is done in the UK. And the context of it is how to use SNOMED CT to standardize lab tests. So then you might want to ask, okay, so why would you want to do this in SNOMED CT instead of LOINC? So as you can see, in England and broadly in the UK, the standards that are mandated are actually not LOINC. It's actually SNOMED. It's the SNOMED CT, FHIR, and UCOM for sharing lab results. And of course, the UK has a long-standing history of using something else called the PVCL, right? About 3,000 something codes, lead codes for sharing lab results, certainly in primary care. And again, the background to this work is, I think for the past 2 years or 3 years, the UK NRC, which is NHS Digital, have actually kicked off a piece of work that has published what we call the Unified Test List, or the UTL. So it's around 4,200 SNOMED concepts, a combination of requests and result codes that could be used, and of course it is based on SNOMED CT. So the key takeaway is there's around 3,800 new SNOMED concepts that could be used to standardize lab test results using SNOMED CT. Right. So with that out of the way, the other reasons, right, are advantages why you might want to use SNOMED in this space is because A, as somebody pointed out earlier, UK has a long experience of migrating and successfully adopting SNOMED CT. So they recently moved all of their primary code systems to this. So that's one advantage. And of course, having a single terminology for all of healthcare, health and care, and different specialisms in lab science also makes sense. So if you want to check out how this works out in different disciplines in lab medicine, then please check out Sarah Harry, my colleague's presentation later in the afternoon. Okay, so a bit of context about the work that actually was done. So this is a pilot that we did across 2 large regions in Scotland, Grampian and Lothian. They call them boards. So if you see the word board, then you know it's essentially a large region. It's a pilot. It's not do everything. So the scope is, of course, going to be limited, but the scope was specifically designed to cover different lab specialisms. For the record, according to the Royal College of Pathologists in the UK, there are 17 specialties in lab. We picked 3 to do it, right? Okay. Second, why did they want to do it? Often it's a case of understanding what was actually needed doing, as opposed to here's a theoretical piece of activity. So in this case, they wanted to create a single test catalog of lab tests based on SNOMED CT. They wanted to then use this as a way of standardizing their lab results, which are currently in HL7v2, and using local codes, or essentially uncoded, to go into HL7 FHIR plus SNOMED CT. So that's the second objective they had. And they also wanted to understand how the governance would work, because as we'll discuss, mapping can be very tricky, gaining consensus can be very tricky. Okay, so before I go into the actual details, I think it's useful to see at the bird's eye view as to what was actually done. So if you take, sorry, that's the product, but if you think of a system where you could do the mapping, so you will, okay, have different pieces. Okay, what are the different pieces? The different pieces that they had in their story was they had a central system, this where they do the mapping. They had a middleware instance, for people who don't always come across the word middleware, think of it as a trust integration layer that most people have, or a hospital integration layer. And they had a repository of data, which I think you can imagine it being a Firestore or an OpenEHR store, it doesn't matter which one you come from, right? So the plan was to then take the Grampian or a sites test list and actually feed it into the engine that could allow them to do the mappings to SNOMED CT, right? Or essentially, that's the way of standardizing their test list into SNOMED. And what would then happen is they would actually then start to populate their, what they would call a single standardized test list. Okay, so then goes forward, these maps are actually then available in the integration engine. They feed their lab reports into this space. And what comes out of it is they then use the mappings on the fly to actually transform these reports and they make them standardized lab results, right? So that's basically what their POC was, and that was their broad use case. Now you can imagine, as part of it, if we're doing this in SNOMED, you get some side benefits that you can actually get a SNOMED CT representation of this test list, which is great. And of course, now from their perspective, they could then actually have another site come in and do this. This kind of works out the same. And as this grows, they create a single standardized test list of lab tests that they actually offer. Why would they want to do it? Well, multiple reasons. Well, their reason was to say, cool, could we now use this as a test catalog to prime their LIMS or actually to configure their order forms? Okay, so again, really quick overview, moving on. So what would this single test catalog look like? So think of two sites that were trying to actually standardize their test list, right? So you can imagine a broader use case. Lots of people try to standardize registries. So this is the sort of thing that people do also, right? But I don't want to make examples. So imagine this is the first site that have got their local codes on the left, which are classic examples. If you are English speaking and you work in a lab, you'll recognize that's what is called a local code, and that's the name of the test. So what happens is you do some magic, and when you do the magic, you want to convert these ones into the corresponding SNOMED CT equivalents. And imagine the same thing being done for a different site, right? So when you do the same thing for a different site, notice how this, again, it gets mapped to SNOMED CT, but if you notice in this example, you've got two things going on here, which are two examples of vitamin D, but they've got different local codes and different ways of saying the same thing, but they map to the same thing in SNOMED CT. So you could use SNOMED CT as a way of actually then not only interoperating, but also creating what they call a single test list. All right. And this is what you can load into LIMS system or a form system or anywhere else. So that's basically one of the aspects of what they want to do. So this is what we also use SNOMED CT for in their context. All the downstream use cases are secondary. We'll come back to those ones later. So here's a summary of the findings, right? So we try to do this for their pilot and for the scope that we had, and we found that SNOMED CT works pretty well for lab tests that cover both primary and secondary care, right? We did find some content that was missing in UTL/SNOMED CT. So if I refer to UTL, I am also in effect referring to SNOMED CT, right? But we found that we could add content to fill this gap, right? And we obviously use close coordination. We'll show you what that means. Second part of it is, of course, once you do this work, transformation of V2 codes as V2 messages works very well. And key takeaways for anybody who's actually just doing mapping is you always want to get some consensus when you are doing some mapping work and you want to have some governance in place. So treat those as by-the-by findings. So let's go. Okay, and before I jump away and people ask me, how many did you find? How many did you not find? That's a broad summary of what we did and how many we were able to actually map to SNOMED CT, and more importantly, the ones that needed new codes creating or new concepts being created, right? Okay, and of course, there were reasons why some of them could not be mapped, but for this conversation, they're out of scope, and for the scope of the project, also they were out of scope. We'll come back to those if anybody is interested. Okay, so what are the actual findings? Because this is really about SNOMED CT as opposed to anything else, right? Let's actually look at the findings. And in this case, first thing Again, I don't know how many people from the lab context are in that meeting room, right? So a lot of times in the lab context, and broadly also in the mapping context, you also want to have to deal with what's the right thing to map to, or what's the level of detail to map to, right? So in this case, for example, if I said, okay, fibrinogen level, which is the name of a test, right? You can get a bunch of results. So don't worry about the detail there. What you really, and most people trying to do the mapping, you're going to think is what's the right one to pick, because I've got a bunch of ones. Do I pick the most granular as in the most specific, or do I pick the least granular, because that is actually going to be more reusable? So that's something to bear in mind. We'll come back to that question later on. Second, the broader principle we found that actually works is always tell the people doing the mapping to actually pick the most, what they think is the exact equivalent for their given setting. And we think that this applies to any mapping project across the board, right? And when you do the most granular for their use case, you could always use SNOMED CT to group things together. We'll come back to exact examples of what this is. Okay. Now, the big difference that we found in the lab world is determining if something is a request or a result. And we'll show some examples of how this played out in SNOMED CT. All right. So moving on. First thing in the lab world that we found was tricky, but actually worthwhile keeping in mind is specimens are actually significant in the lab world. So if I said I did a test, and you can see those examples of skin lesion and nasopharyngeal swab are actually based on some really recent horrible diseases in the world, right? Skin lesions are for monkeypox, and nasopharyngeal swabs, I think we're sick and tired of hearing the COVID thing, right? But that's why specimens where you collected the sample from us is really important in the lab work. But there can also be cases where specimens are actually not significant. So when you're trying to say this test is the same as this test, they might not be significant. The only people who can make this determination are actually the people in the lab. Okay, so another reason why we keep saying governance, consensus, this is absolutely important. So let's take an example. I've got example of FSH. So obviously, so by the way, the screenshots that you're seeing are screenshots from a system that we use to do the mapping. So in this case, it's saying, hey, there are two ones that are actually possible for FSH. So you can see one is clearly plasma, one is serum. So somebody has to make the determination, right? And that's what that thing is actually saying. So obviously you have to, I won't show you the exact mapping process, but you want to make the determination. And the people making the determination will have to be the lab specialists. So this is actually important. So continuing with specimens. So we know, or at least if you ask anybody in the lab, they'll tell you the specimen is absolutely important because it determines whether two tests are comparable and they can be plotted on a screen. But what if you don't need to essentially make this distinction, right? So this is the second use case. And if you don't need to make this distinction, what we found was that SNOMED still works. Right. So in the previous case where you had plasma and serum separately, that's cool. But what if you didn't have it? It's still cool because there are existing specimens that are what you might call grouper specimens that actually exist in SNOMED. So those are examples. And here are some examples on the screen as to what these would look like. Okay. And if you're clever enough and you got the understanding of SNOMED, you can actually then work out that you can use post-formation to do some of this also. And the thing to remember is the previous rule. Pick the most specific one for your use case and then use post-coordination or SNOMED CT semantics to pull out or group these things together. Okay, the one thing to take away is if you're going to rely on post-coordination in some way, sometimes you might be affected by some of the concepts not being fully defined. Just a takeaway message, that's all. Okay, so that's the thing around specimens. The third thing, I don't know again, we might be the only people who have tried to do this, so this is useful to share. SNOMED is constructed of layers, remember? So there's the what we call the UTL / the UK Palm edition. We've got the UK, which itself builds on the UK clinical edition, and that itself builds on the international edition. So the question here is, how do you determine which is the most relevant match or the test to actually pick? Okay, so for example, if I got two glucose, which one is the most relevant one? What do I show first? Because remember, these are people who are not necessarily informatics experts, terminology experts. These are probably people who work in the lab because they're the best people who know what it is that they do, right? So what do you show at the top? So that's what I mean by determining relevance. Of course, there's a lot of science behind it, but a few things to bear in mind. I wouldn't deliberately leaving this at the high level is, A, The system needs to be able to learn, which is why in this case, you're seeing something of a different color right at the top. Okay. Second, is the order of extensions important? So we think generally that the national extensions generally outweigh the international extension. Now, this is an international edition. This is a very controversial thing to say because, of course, the devil is always in the detail. But when we did this, we found that actually it was also better. Okay, so I'm happy again for anybody who wants to strongly disagree to hold fire, and we can pick this up during the conversations or discussions toward the end, right? Okay, then moving on. What do you then do with missing content? So I hinted at this. I said, okay, UTL, as we do not cover everything. So what do you do if there's missing content? So you have got some lab test, you cannot map it because it doesn't exist in SNOMED, it doesn't exist in LOIN, anything else. So generally, people tend to say, oh, no, this is not going to be the case. I kind of tend to be, a bit skeptical because I want to then challenge people and say, well, how many tests actually existed on monkeypox before 2022, right? So that's an interesting concept. But I think we have to recognize that this is a changing world. New tests are always needed. So typically what we do, right, for a person in a lab, they want to now use a report and a test. What are we expecting them to do? Are we expecting them to request a new code from the NRC? Or can we actually controversially allow people to create their own standardized test on the fly, right? And this is where we think the real world use case exists. So I'm not making these up. So if you go and look at SNOMED CT at the moment, one of the recommended tests for cardiac testing, which is high sensitivity tests for troponins, can't be currently added to SNOMED CT. Okay, I'm not talking politics. I'm saying it can't be because the technique hierarchy doesn't have these things at all. You would want the techniques to be in there so you can actually create it. Okay, so what did we have to do? We ended up having to create the techniques, and then we had to create these concepts. Okay, now I know if you will say, well, hang on, everybody can do this, Jay. If you sit down, if you're an NRC, no, we're talking about people who are on the ground being able to do this. And how do we do this? Because we do this by using post coordination, right? And here's an example of a whole bunch of other things we had to create using the same paradigm. So just to show probably a less political example, so I said, okay, how do we do this? Let's say if you're testing mass concentration of amiodarone, which is a drug in plasma / serum specimen. That's what ACE-RELILA means, right? So in the way we built this, we said, okay, as long as somebody can record what it is that they're measuring, okay, so you do this, and the moment they select what it is that they're measuring, because remember, these are lab people, the system can actually on the fly generate postcode expressions. Okay, remember, when I say system, we're not here to sell you the system, we're actually here to tell you what the approach we took is. So it generates 2 postcode expressions on the fly, right? And you can check these out, what these actually are. They're fully defined SNOMED CT concepts. So you can see that it actually came back with, is it a substance or a mass concentration? Okay, there's some cleverness behind it. I won't go into detail, but it's also proposing based on SNOMED rules, the FS7PT, and people can then edit their own similarly. That's what they want. The relationships are fully modeled based on the observables entity. Now, what we do is we don't show them the entire complexity of the observable model. We show them, here's the thing that you need to know as a lab user. So why do you want to do this, right? So I said, okay, great, tests don't exist. And you might say, but hang on, Jay, there might be very few and far in between. That's cool, no problem. But remember, diagnostics is very, very rapidly expanding. So it means that new diseases, new things being discovered, and new tests being introduced, right? But the other side of it, again, I'm just going to mention it in passing, is you can actually then use the same approach to actually then say, interoperate, how to take something that is built in SNOMED and interoperate with something in LOINC, right? So this is an example of the same thing, but we now say, oh, show me what tests instead of creating it exist in LOINC, right? So semantically, we can actually go transform this into LOINC. And if you want to know more of this, then I think you should go back to the PALM group, which are actually talking about LOINC, essentially lab data interoperation, right? So I'll keep this to the slide for now. So this is not just blood sciences, this actually works for other disciplines. You can now do things like colony counts, you can do susceptibility in microbiology, all right? And it all works. The takeaway message here is just because Jay said, go do this, please don't do it. Always remember that there's balance between the terminology model and the information model. And where you want to do your post-coordination or pre-coordination is extremely important. This is where the informatics thing comes. We show you what can be done if you actually take this example and that it works really well for other disciplines also. Okay, this is probably the last of my slides. So, okay, How does this work then in the request space? The way it works in the request space is actually SNOMED works. We found it works very well because there's a lot of historical precedent to it, right? So fecal porphyrins, you already get enough matches. And that's what people can tell us also, our users tell us. Okay, now the thing is, what happens with something controversial like panels? Okay, great. The liver function test is a panel. That exists in SNOMED CT, but when you say what is actually a liver function test, it becomes really complex. We think that actually works kind of better, much better than LOINC, right? But then there's a whole different kind of worms around localization of panels, which doesn't seem to work in that. Again, we're showing you just our experience of using SNOMED versus something else, but here's what we found is missing. Okay, now this is very specific to the UK. In the UK, there's some horrible, horrible being the wrong word. There could be some gotchas, right? So in this case, you're seeing fluid triglycerides. The first one and the second one are slightly different. One is a request, one is not a request. So in the UK, there's some things that got moved from procedures to observables. So there's some traps there. Okay. So, sorry, I did say that was my last slide, but actually looks like, okay. Finally, just a summary. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is it's absolutely possible to standardize lab tests and results using SNOMED CT. Works for blood sciences and other disciplines also. If content is missing, you can actually use post-coordination to create these new tests, and there's a legitimate use case for it. Of course, it also then opens a door for actually saying, hey, I've got stuff happening in SNOMED, but I can now also use something like LOINC, because LOINC comes with its really cool stuff like Livid, UCOM, all those things, right? So it's all the good stuff that comes across. And what I haven't covered in this slide, in this summary, or sorry, in this presentation, is all the implementation issues around what actually happens, how do you do the transformation of messages, analytics, and blah, blah, right? So questions? There's our emails that you can contact us with. We want to also credit and acknowledge NHS Digital for doing some fantastic work on the UTL and the two Scottish ports that allows us to actually do this work and also use their Teslas for doing this work. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay, for a really interesting session. We can now probably take a couple of questions, but if you just wait for the mic to come to you, would anybody like to ask Jay a question at this time? Got a couple, pick up the mic.
Hi, that was really interesting. This may be one of those implementation questions that's out of the scope of this presentation, but what had to happen to the software that's being used in laboratories to accommodate post-coordinated codes?
Okay. Really interesting question. So the entire premise of what we built is very common. So the entire premise of what we built is to enable lab systems to move from where they are. We know some of them are stuck in the 90s, all right, to SNOMED CT while retaining their own local codes. The local codes are 4-digit, 3-digit code. They can't cope with post-coordination at all. So the reason why some of this was done is to enable those systems to coexist with native SNOMED compliant systems. Does that make sense? So there's you're absolutely right. I think there's a different implementation part of what we did. Sorry, I don't want to go into too much detail at this moment, just because the current systems didn't have to change. Most of this complexity was managed in our software. And for the record, our software also actually assigns a SNOMED CT concept. If you think of it as its own extension, then it adds to the extension if the existing system can't go with post-coordination. So you have a fully defined SNOMED CT concept that also has an ID. So system can't use it. Sorry, can't use post-coordination. It can take the ID and do this on the fly.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Probably one more question. Anybody? I thought there was somebody else with a hand raised.
Thank you, Jay. I'm in a field where we're doing genomics pathology, so an area where there's lots of stuff that's new and having to come up with lots of new concepts, etc. where you take the approach of doing post-coordinated expressions, do you also feel there's value in following up with national release centres to try to get codes actually, primitive codes made, and any recommendations for how to incentivize my lab who may not care much about that process to do the hard work of doing that for however long it takes?
Yeah. So is that Michael Lawley? Is that?
No,
Sorry.
but
Aussie accent.
I know
I can't
Michael.
make up for me. Yeah, so that's fine. So, okay, absolutely brilliant questions. I think I hear people say all the time, Jay, what, you're solving your problem with this. I'm like, no, tests are exploding at the moment. You got to do something like this, right? So the strategy is we take the pain away from the people, from the poor people in the lab, because they don't want to deal with it. We take the whole system away, right? So the system handles this absolutely in a principled way. It always says that, remember that hierarchy of extensions that I mentioned? Well, guess what? There's another extension that sits there, right? It's the regional extension, which, as you pointed out, needs to be coordinated and synced with the national extension. We take care of all the complexity. And there's some really interesting questions around this. Your question, I think, was, well, what advice can you take away? So I'll say, come and talk to us when you're doing this, because we would want to learn from how you guys are actually doing this also. But we believe the way to actually handle this is to allow, or no, to do two things. One, to get in touch with your NRC to tell them that this is what you're actually supporting. Second, look at the work that the PALM group are actually trying to do about interoperability using post-coordinate expressions. I think if it's pushed in the right way, that could lead to what I would call faster promotion of content that is common across a lot of countries. That's certainly been our experience. The more you do this stuff, the more reusable content you get, and it actually then starts to fill out very nicely what actually is needed. Sorry if I didn't explain that very clearly.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay, again, for a really interesting session and answering a couple of questions for us. So that now concludes the session. Please go and attend what you want to next. If you're playing our online game participation, then scan the QR code on the door and that'll get you into that game. Online attendees, if you go back to the lobby and then choose your next session. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Jay, again.
Thanks, guys. Bye now.